Hello, dear students. Myself, Sunita, professor in biology. We shall be starting today's session. Before that, let me introduce you to the first year topics. So basically, we have 22 chapters in first year, which comprises of 5 units. So out of these 5 units, the first unit is Diversity in the Living World, which comprises of 4 chapters. Second unit is Structural Organization in Plants and Animals, which has 3 chapters. The third unit is Cell, Structure and its Function, which again has 3 chapters. Coming to the fourth unit is Plant Physiology, which has 5 chapters. And then the last unit, Unit 5, is Human Physiology, which comprises of 7 chapters. So overall, you have 22 chapters in your first PU syllabus. So today we shall be looking into the first unit, the first chapter of the first unit, that is the living world. So in this chapter, living world, as the word says living and the world. So we'll be looking first about what exactly is living. So let me take you through the contents of this chapter. So what are we going to learn here? We'll be learning about what is living, as I said you. And when we have to call an organism as living, it has to exhibit certain characters. So we'll be going through the characters today. And then we'll be understanding the beautiful diversity in the living world. And lastly, for today's topic, we'll be learning about what are the universal rules of binomial nomenclature and what exactly is binomial nomenclature. Okay, so let us go ahead by understanding what exactly is living. So living means what? We all know the word living means the state of being alive. So if we have to call an organism as living, it is nothing but being alive. So being alive means what? Maybe in terms of breathing, maybe in terms of respiration, maybe in terms of exchange of gases, maybe in terms of growth, maybe in terms of reproduction. It has to possess certain characters. So we have a beautiful world around, isn't it? And we are surrounded by living organisms. So starting from the smallest organisms which we cannot see through our naked eyes, like microorganisms, isn't it? So, and the organisms which we can even explore them, isn't it? Like the plants, the animals, the other group of organisms. So all these constitute living. And when we talk about a living organism, how is it different from non-living? So we cannot call it as non-living organism, but we can refer it to as non-living thing. So in other words, living and non-living can be also referred to as animate and inanimate. Okay, so living organisms can be called as animate and non-living can be called as inanimate. That means the one which has life and the other one which do not possess life. Okay, so this is non-living thing. So as I told you, to differentiate between non-living and living thing, so you have been doing this in your lower classes, isn't it? And we also know the characteristic features of living organism. So what are the characteristic features of living organism? So this is most important, which we have to understand when we call organism as living. So let us look into the first characteristic feature. So when you take any organism, living organism, or any organism which we have to call it as living, it should possess the first and foremost character, that is growth. Okay, so what is growth? How do we define growth? We all know all the living organisms will grow, but there are two important things to define growth. So growth has twin characters. So what are these twin characters? One is, number one, increase in mass. Mass refer to density, mass refer to weight, okay? And the second character is the increase in number of individuals. So when we talk about increase in number of individuals, we all know living organisms will grow through a process called as division, isn't it? So what type of division? The division is called as cell division. So when we talk about cell division, it may be in the form of the reductional division, or it may be in the form of equational division. So if we have to call it as equational division, then we call it as mitosis. And if we have to call it as reductional division, we call it as meiosis. Okay. So of course, you will be discussing, you'll be understanding more about mitosis and meiosis in a separate chapter. Okay. And then so all these organisms, whether you take unicellular organisms, that is, which possess single cell, or multicellular organisms, which are made up of many number of cells, okay? So both undergo cell division. So when cell divides, okay, when we look into a cell, so when this cell is going to divide either by mitotic division or by meiotic division, there will be increase in number. Okay, so there will be increasing number. This was 1. Now it has become 1A, 1B. If I have to refer, they are the daughter cells. So the number of cells or number of individuals have been more. It is increased. So this is called as the twin characters of growth. So increasing mass. So obviously when the number goes on increasing, even the mass or the density also will increase gradually. Okay. So this is called as growth. And with respect to plants and animals, if we have to define growth, we all know that the growth in case of plants is a continuous process. How do we say it as a continuous process? We know that throughout the life, the growth of the plant will go on, isn't it? So if you have planted a sapling, so you grow, give it proper nourishment and proper water, so it goes on growing and growing. The cell division is continuously occurring in these organisms. So henceforth, we can say that the growth is continuous. The growth is continuous throughout its lifespan, isn't it? Throughout its life. That is in case of plants. How about in case of animals? Is it lifespan? Is it continuous? Do we grow throughout our life? No, isn't it? So you people have certain age to grow, isn't it? So you grow in your height up to certain age. Likewise, weight is continuous, isn't it? It depends on how the how the body consumes what type of food, the food habits, and then how much do you give the proper exercise to the body, isn't it? So based on all those things, the weight will be increasing and decreasing, isn't it? But in case of animals, if we have to tell about the growth, it is only up to certain age. Okay, so the cell division for, let's take length, it is only up to certain age. So that is what is the difference between the growth in case of plants and growth in case of animals. But if you have to take the growth as a property, okay, of a living organism, so it is a process which will be undergoing by cell division. Then here comes a question. If the growth is happening in case of living organism, if we have to define the growth as increasing mass and increase in number, is it possible for growth to occur in non-living objects? Will non-living objects grow? Yes, of course, it does grow, isn't it? So let's take examples. So what are the examples if we have to take? So if we have to take examples, we can take example of mountain. You all have heard that mountain can grow. The boulders can be taken as an example. And just you would have played in your, when you were young, or sometimes when you have played with the sand molds, isn't it? So you, when you have played, obviously you would have poured more and more sand. So when more and more sand is poured, so the growth of the sand mold is more, isn't it? So can we refer it to as growth? Because our definition says Increase in mass and increase in number of individuals is growth. So at least if not increase in number of individuals with respect to the sand molds, we can say increase in mass. Okay, so henceforth, non-living objects also will grow. So if we have to conclude saying that non-living objects will grow, can I say growth is a defining property of living organism? Defining property means what then? Defining property means if it has to be growth, growth should not happen in case of non-living things. Okay, so growth is restricted only to living things. If we have to say it is a defining feature or a defining property of living organisms, that means it should not have any exceptions. But in our case, growth is having exceptions. How is it having exceptions? Because we understood that non-living things also can grow, isn't it? Non-living things also can grow, right? So mountains can grow, boulders can grow, sand molds can grow. Then it cannot be a defining property of living organisms because it has exceptions. Very, very important. It has exceptions. What is that exception? The exception is non-living organisms, non-living objects can grow. Okay, so henceforth, growth is not a defining property. It's not a defining property. Then what do we call this as? Growth can be called as characteristic feature. It is one of the characteristic feature of living organism. Okay, it is just the characteristic feature of living organism, but you cannot call it as a defining property. The one which do not have any exceptions can be called as defining property. Okay, so this is regarding growth. Now let us understand the next part, next character, that is, yes, before that, you can see the sand mold which has been grown in the sense which have been increased in its mass. Okay, right. Let's go to the next character, that is reproduction. So how do we define reproduction? We all know that if we have to say growth, reproduction also will follow. So reproduction means the production of progeny possessing features more or less similar to those of parents. So it is nothing but the passing of the characteristic features, the traits from one generation to another generation, from parents' generation to the next generation, that is the offspring generation, and that will go on for the many number of generations, isn't it? So this overall process is called as reproduction. And you all are familiar with what is reproduction and the types of reproduction, isn't it? So what are the types of reproduction? Basically, we all know that there are two types of reproduction. One is asexual reproduction. The other one is sexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction, as the word says, and then you have sexual reproduction. First, we'll understand what is sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction, the word sexual represents the presence of gametes. The presence of gametes. So we know that there is two type of gametes. One is the male gametes and the other one we call it as female gametes. So during the process of sexual reproduction, we know that the crossing over or the fusion will take place to produce the zygote, isn't it? So to produce zygote, and involvement of gametes for the fusion of zygote, the process is also called as fertilization. So later it will undergo meiosis, and that is how it will complete its reproduction. Okay, so sexual reproduction involves the production of gametes, so henceforth the word says sexual. Okay, so then what is asexual? Asexual means without the presence of gametes. No gametes are produced here. Okay, no gametes are produced here. Then if no gametes are produced, then what are the types of asexual reproduction? So there are different types of asexual reproduction. Lower organisms, if we have to take, they are undergoing this asexual reproduction by spore formation. asexual reproduction. There are a lot of means of asexual reproduction. Maybe like we'll just go on listing. That is by spore formation in case of fungi, spores in case of fungi. Second one, we can say regeneration in case of planaria. Regeneration in case of planaria. Then comes the binary fission in case of amoeba. Maybe budding in case of yeast. Okay, all these are the means of asexual reproduction, right? So it can be anything, but whatever they are undergoing, they are going to produce the progeny, which are more or less similar to those of parents, not 100%, because we know that except for identical twins, so all the organisms, especially the offsprings which are produced from the parents, they are going to be dissimilar. Okay, so dissimilar in the sense not completely, so partially they'll be dissimilar. So henceforth the reproduction can be divided into asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction based on the presence or without the gametes formation, but by other means. Now, when we talk about reproduction, do all living organisms reproduce? Definitely yes, right? But are there any exceptions? Have we come across any exceptions? If you have to think for it, so yes, of course, there is exception. So what are the exceptions which you see here? Let's look into the examples for the exceptions. Okay, so what are the exceptions? If you have come across the types of honeybees, so basically in honeybee there is a main bee which is called as queen bee, which is undergoing the process of reproduction. But whereas in case of the other bees, so which are called as worker bees, and the drones which are called as male bee, so they do not undergo any fertilization, or they are not undergoing any process of reproduction. So this can be taken as one of the example. Okay, and then the other example, if we have to take, if you have come across mules, the cross between the donkey and the horse, mules can be also taken as an example which do not undergo any further process of fertilization. And one more example can be taken as with regard to the human couple. So some of them, they are unable to produce the young ones, progeny. So we call them as infertile human couples. Infertile human couples. Okay, so all these can be taken as an example for exception in case of reproduction. So not all living organisms are able to reproduce, but there are few exceptions. Okay, so there are few exceptions. So once again, if I have to take exception, then what type of whether it is a defining property, whether reproduction is a defining property or not, we need to understand. So we all know if there is exception, we can just call reproduction as a characteristic feature, but we cannot say it as a defining property. Okay, and one more thing to add on to this asexual reproduction, in case of algae, you might have come across that they undergo fragmentation. Okay, so they are undergoing fragmentation, especially the filamentous algae, those who are in the form of filament, they are undergoing fragmentation, right? So but ultimately they all are the processes of reproduction. But one thing we need to come across here, when we talk about any unicellular organism, okay, any unicellular organism, let's take a bacteria, or let's take a unicellular algae. So these unicellular organisms, in unicellular organisms, the growth and reproduction is same, because you know that one single cell will be undergoing the formation of growth. It goes on multiplying and the number goes on increasing. Whereas in case of reproduction for them, yes, again, they are going to be producing the offsprings, but they'll be similar to that of parents. So growth and reproduction are same in case of unicellular, organisms, but it goes on varying with respect to the different group of organisms, any multicellular organisms, right? So this is it regarding the reproduction. So you can see here the amoeboid cell, which is undergoing, this is the parental cell. The parental cell is undergoing the division. Basically, the nucleus is going to divide, and after it divides, it is undergoing the cytoplasmic division. And further, there are two daughter cells are produced. So the number of cell is increased here, and the progeny is also formed. So henceforth, in case of unicellular organism, the growth and reproduction remains same. So, but whereas multicellular organism, the zygote is going to be formed during the process of fertilization by fusion of gametes, and this zygote is undergoing the development to form a new offspring. So as we come to the conclusion that reproduction is not a defining property because it has exceptions. Okay, because it has exceptions. Okay, I hope you have understood. Let's move on to the next character, that is metabolism. So what exactly is metabolism? So we all know that our body is made up of complex nature. That is, it is made up of many chemicals, isn't it? Biomolecules are present. So carbohydrates, proteins, fats, nucleic acids, right? Genetic material. So, and we know that our body is being coordinated, right? With the hormones, with the blood, the connective tissues. So it's a coordinated way, isn't it? It's working in a systematic manner. So all these chemical reactions which are going on continuously, spontaneously, it is going to happen. When we have to combine all the chemical reactions taking place in our body, which is undergoing simultaneously inside the cells, we call that process as metabolism. Metabolism means what? So you can take down the definition of metabolism. The sum total of all the chemical reactions or biochemical reactions occurring in our body is called as metabolism. So metabolism is something unique to living organisms. Yes, of course. If we talk about non-living objects, chemical reactions are going on in them. Do they have something called a cell to exhibit this chemical reactions? Definitely not, isn't it? So no living, non-living objects exhibit metabolism. So it's a unique feature for only living organisms. So when we talk about metabolism, further it can be divided into two parts. Okay. So you might have heard that metabolism is a continuous process. So we got to know from the definition. But there are two other processes where the chemical reactions may be constructive or the chemical reactions may be destructive. Okay, it may be a simple process or it may be a complex process. So based on this, we have two types. One is anabolism, and the other type is catabolism. Anabolism means what? So anabolism is a constructive process. We call it as a constructive process. Why do we call it as a constructive process? Because so many simple molecules, when we combine, it forms a complex molecule. Okay, we are going to produce energy, and that energy will be used for a constructive mechanism. Let's take a typical example in case of plants. So example for this anabolism is your photosynthesis. Okay, photosynthesis. So in case of photosynthesis, we all know that photosynthesis is nothing but the synthesis of food using the sunlight, where the light energy will be converted into chemical energy, and that energy will be stored, and that will be used for the further processes. So we are going to use the energy from the sun to produce food. Production itself is something which we call it as constructive process. Okay, so henceforth photosynthesis can be taken as a constructive metabolism, which we call it as anabolism. Okay, which we can call it as anabolic process, or it is called as anabolism. Then comes the other opposite one, that is the destructive process. Destruction, as the word says. What do we do here? Whatever the energy has been stored during the process of photosynthesis is now going to be broken down. And during the process of photosynthesis, the stored energy will be in the form of starch or will be in the form of glucose. And breakdown of glucose will take place to synthesize or to, again liberate the energy during a process which we call it as respiration, So henceforth, what do we infer from this? We can understand that catabolism is called as destructive process. If a complex molecule is formed, it is going to break down into many simpler molecules. Okay, so glucose is going to be broken down into smaller molecules such that that is going to liberate energy. Okay, that is going to liberate energy, and this process is called as destructive process. So metabolism includes two important processes. Further process, it may be constructive or it may be destructive. That is, it may be anabolic or it may be catabolic process. Okay, so as I was telling you that this major part of it, that is metabolism, is only constricted only to the living organisms, but no non-living organism can exhibit. I mean, non-living objects can exhibit. But if we have to take an example, you all have done several experiments and you all know about several experiments which you do in chemistry or in the laboratory conditions. So in the laboratory conditions, if we have to talk about a test tube, and you know that in a test tube, if we have to take a test tube and then add some certain chemicals to this, okay, we are going to add certain chemicals to this. What type of chemicals? Maybe a living tissue. It may be a living tissue. Okay. It may be a living tissue or a living cell. Can we say that the metabolic reaction is happening here? The metabolic reaction is happening inside the cell? Yes, we can refer it to as chemical reaction is happening. But can we say the metabolic process is taking place inside the test tube? Definitely not. We cannot refer it to. We call it as a cell-free system, which we also call it as in vitro experiment or in vitro. In vitro means it is outside the body, but inside a test tube, or inside a Petri plate, anything. So it can be demonstrated. Any living tissue showing any chemical reaction can be demonstrated inside the test tube, but it cannot be called as metabolism. It's just a chemical reaction which is going on. Okay, we can see them live, but we cannot call it as a metabolic reaction which is taking place, because we know that the chemical reactions which are occurring in the body is called as metabolism. So henceforth, metabolism do not have any exceptions. Okay, metabolism do not have any exceptions, so we can refer it to as defining property or defining feature of all living organisms. So all living organisms are going to possess the defining feature, the first defining feature which we have learned, that is metabolism. Okay, so going ahead with the next one, that is cellular organization. So cellular organization, as the word says, it's very simple. We know that we all are made up of cells, isn't it? So cell, if you have to define a cell, then we know that cell is the basic unit of life. So whether you take the microorganisms, they are all made up of cells, but we cannot make out them through our naked eyes. Of course, macroorganisms is also made up of cells. The cells may be made up of further tissues. The tissue may be differentiated into organ. The organ may be differentiated into organ system, right, to make an organism. So overall, when we look into the cell, so cell forms the basic unit of life. So basic unit of life is the cell with regard to both unicellular organisms or with regard to multicellular organisms. So that means all living organisms are made up of cell. Okay, so henceforth, what do we infer from this? We can understand that cellular organization is again a defining property. So cellular organization is again a defining property because know that non-living objects is definitely not made up of cells. All right. So henceforth, cellular organization is a defining feature. So till now we have discussed two characteristic feature of living organisms, and we also have come across the two defining feature of all living organism. Let us move on to the last one, that is the consciousness. So now what exactly is consciousness? So how do we define consciousness? So consciousness is, in simple words, you can say that response to stimuli. So we all respond to stimuli, isn't it? So if there is some danger, our body will definitely respond and then take a step back. Or if you have some object which is very hot, immediately your hand will be taken back. Of course, that is reflex action which will be done by our body, but still we are able to sense. Why we are able to sense? We know that we all are made up of sense organs, isn't it? So not only we, any of the living organisms, they are having the ability to sense. You have learned in case of plants that plants are able to undergo the sense of touch. Thigmonasty, we call it as thigmonasty. Okay, the plants have the sensitivity to receive the light, which we can call it as the photosensitivity. The plants are having the ability to undergo the changes with regard to the climate. They are going to respond in different ways. So the ability to have that sense itself is much more important, which we call it as consciousness. Ability to sense their surroundings or environment and respond to these environmental stimuli. See, one thing is we are receiving the stimuli, and the other way around, we are also responding to the stimuli, which may be in form of anything. It may be physical response, it may be chemical response, it may be biological response. So chemical response in the sense, sometimes what happens when there is some agent, unknown agent, which has entered into your body, your body starts reacting, isn't it? Say for example, you're walking through a park, and then you are you are exposed to a lot of plants over there, and somehow you start sneezing. That is because of maybe the dust particle or the pollen or anything which would have entered into your nose or into your respiratory tract, and that has caused some reactions in your body, and that is bringing about the sneeze, isn't it? So that may be a chemical reactions when you receive a stimuli and you're going to respond accordingly. So this is called as consciousness. So henceforth, we can say that living organisms are able to respond. Obviously, non-living organisms, you have kept a chair or a bench or whatever you say, so it is not going to respond until and unless you push it, isn't it? So we can call it as consciousness. But human beings, we are lucky enough to be self-conscious. We know what is happening around us, within us, right, and beyond us also sometimes, right? So we can even talk to each other, and then we can even respond to each other. So that is self-consciousness. So self-consciousness is once again a property which is only with regard to human beings. That is how we are able to respond and have the higher consciousness. So by this, we understand that consciousness also is a property which can be, you know, the response and stimulus which I have told you is represented in a diagrammatic way, and we can understand and infer from this that consciousness is the defining property of living organism. But when we take certain instances, like some person has met with an accident, or he has lost his consciousness, or he is in coma in the hospital, can we say those can we say those living beings, or can we say those patients who are brain dead as conscious? No, generally we don't call it as conscious, but the continuous mechanical action, that is chemical actions, will be going on in his body. Okay, so until he comes back to his normal life, we cannot say him as a non-living object, but we do refer it to as living itself. Okay, so the other like if he's brain dead, the other functions will be happening inside his body. The metabolic reactions will be taken inside the body. The chemical interactions will be going on in the body. So henceforth, even at the molecular level, it will be going on. So henceforth, we cannot say him as a non-living object, but we do refer it to as living itself, but considered to be brain dead. Okay, so this is it regarding the different characteristic features of living organisms. So if we have to call the living organism as living, then they have to possess all these characteristic features. Okay, so namely growth, reproduction, metabolism, then comes the cellular organization, and then consciousness. Okay, so let's move on to the next topic. We'll understand now about the living world. So when we have to talk about the world, till now we understood what is living. Now we'll understand what is that world. When we talk about the world, what is world made up of? We are lucky enough to be present in earth, isn't it? When you look around yourself, you can see lot of organisms which are present there, very fascinating and diversified organisms. So those organisms may be in great number all over the world, all over the earth also, isn't it? And these organisms, there are so many organisms which we have to explore. There are so many organisms which are unknown, and some organisms only are known, right? Some organisms are going to be born every day, some of them are going to be extinct every day. So total all the sum of these organisms is what is called as diversity, or in other words, we can even refer it to as biodiversity. Okay, we can even refer it to as biodiversity. Biodiversity means what? It is nothing but the species which are present over there. The richness of the species in a particular area is called as biodiversity. So overall, now the estimation of biodiversity, overall how many species are present, how many millions of species are present, has been uh, known, that is somewhere about 1.7 to 1.8 million species are existing. Okay, 1.7 to 1.8 million species. Number of species are known and they have been described. Okay, so described species are this much. As I told you, there are unknown species which have to be yet explored. So henceforth, the diversity is very huge, and this diversity is because of the vastness, or the the accumulation of so many species in the world. And when we talk about the diversity of India is different, the other countries is different, state-wise diversity is different. I'm not talking about the people here. I'm talking about the plants and animals. So the diversity everywhere is different. So if diversity is different, obviously the local names what we call to these organisms is also different, isn't it? So in case of your languages, you go on differing, calling out the local names. But keeping so many local names will not be, will not be happening very easily, or it will not be very flexible for uh, any of the people to call in other places. So my local name will be flexible only to me. Your local name will be flexible only to that particular area. So other organisms, if you have to call the local names in some other country, it would be difficult. So henceforth, um, one system, there should be a standardized system to call out the names. So our naming of a living organism is very much important. Okay, so there are three important things which we need to understand here. The first one is about the, yes, first one is about nomenclature. Nomenclature means what? Nomenclature means naming. Nomenclature means naming. Okay, nomenclature means naming. So naming of living organism is called as nomenclature, and that particular organism have to be named in the same way all over the world. It should be a universal name. Okay, so otherwise, you know that if I call out here some name and some same, if I call out dog as dog here and some other person over there calls the dog as cat, then it will create a lot of confusion. In order to reduce this confusion, nomenclature is very, very important. Okay, for an organism to understand, the first important criteria is the nomenclature. The second one is identification. So if you look into an X organism, you should identify by its characters, isn't it? Characterization is most important. From your younger age, you would have learned this is the characteristic features of dog, this is the characteristic feature of cat, this is the characteristic feature of elephant, and this is how you identify them. So identification plays a very important role. Unless and until you identify an organism, classification and nomenclature wouldn't be possible. Okay, so the next one is classification. Once you identify this organism, then you're going to give a name, and then you're going to classify them under plants or classify them under animals. So if we have to classify them under plants or animals, then there should be some standardized procedure. That standardized procedure for nomenclature, identification, and classification basically is provided by a set of principles and criteria which have been followed all over the world. So which we call it as ICBN. ICBN refers to International ICBN refers to International Code for Botanical Nomenclature, for Botanical Nomenclature, which gives the naming for the plants. Botanical is plants. And then we have ICZN called as Zoological Nomenclature. Same thing for Zoological Nomenclature. Okay, zoological nomenclature, that is called as ICZN. So these two abbreviations are very important: International Code for Botanical Nomenclature and International Code for Zoological Nomenclature. So based on this, which is universally accepted principles, biologists all over the world will follow the naming system. But for naming system, there should be some specifications. Say, for example, I cannot make my own rules. You cannot make your own rules. So there should be set of rules or principles which have been set already. And that standardization has already made by a person called as Carolus Linnaeus, who was a famous biologist who gave this naming system. That naming system is called as binomial nomenclature. So we'll be learning what exactly is binomial nomenclature. Okay, so binomial nomenclature means what? Binomial nomenclature means that binomial, as the word itself says, it is two. Bi means two, nomenclature means naming. So the naming system has two words. Okay, basically the system of providing name with two components or two words is called as binomial nomenclature. So binomial nomenclature, the first word is called as generic name, and the second word is called as the specific epithet, that is the species name. So this was given by Carolus Linnaeus. So Carolus Linnaeus, he is known as father of taxonomy, modern taxonomy. So taxonomy means it is a branch of biology which deals with whatever we have learned, that is the system of naming or nomenclature, classification, and identification is together called as taxonomy. Okay, so he was basically a taxonomist who studied a lot of plants and animals, and he gave the naming system, and also the set of rules for the naming system was proposed by Carolus Linnaeus. So he had the publication called as Systema Naturae. So you can see here, Systema Naturae is a publication. He has recorded so many plants and animal species, and also has set of rules which have been published in this publication. Okay, a book, right? So you can look into Carolus Linnaeus. Yes, he is known as father of taxonomy. So if we have to talk about father of taxonomy, we should know who is father of botany and father of zoology. So father of botany is Theophrastus. Father of botany is Theophrastus. He is father of botany. Botany is the study of plants. And father of zoology, which is study of animals, is Aristotle. Aristotle is also father of biology. Okay, he's also father of biology. Right. So we'll understand the set of rules. Okay. So these are called as universal rules of nomenclature, binomial nomenclature, because it is accepted universally all over the world. So wherever you take an organism, it will be dog will be called as dog, whether you go to Australia, whether you go to America, or you go to even Antarctica. So it will be the same name. So henceforth, that standardization is called as universal rules of nomenclature. So we'll understand the universal rules now. So what are the rules here? The first rule is biological names, or you can call it as scientific names, are in Latin. They have been derived in Latin and they are written in italics. Okay, they have to be printed in italics font, right? So that is the first rule. The second rule is the first word of the name, as we know, it is called as the genus name. The second word is called as specific epithet. That is nothing but the species name. The third rule is when if it is printed, it will be in italics. If it is handwritten, say for example, I have to write a scientific name. What should I do? Let's take Mangifera indica. Mangifera indica. Okay, I have to underline this separately. But if it is printed in italics, see here, it's printed in italics. So henceforth, it can be retained as such. But if I have to handwrite, you can, when you write it, you have to underline it separately. So that is the third rule. And the fourth rule is the first letter of the first word is written in capital, while the first letter of the specific epithet is small letter. So you can even identify this. M is written as a capital letter and I is written in small letter. Okay. And M represents the genus name, Mangifera represents the genus name, Indica represents the species name. So all these are the rules of binomial nomenclature. Okay. And one more thing we need to understand regarding the binomial nomenclature. Say for example, so in case of this, we should understand that Mangifera indica or Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens common name is man or human being. Mangifera indica is mango. These are the local names or the common names which we can say. And these common names, these two names were given by the author, or you can say the scientist, called as Linnaeus. So if we have to say Linnaeus has given this, or Linnaeus has described this, then I have to give the author citation after the species name. Say for example, Mangifera indica, I can just write it as Linnaeus in full, or I can just write it as LIN and Lin, or I can even put a L dot. Okay, so I have to abbreviate the whole thing, or I can make it into short, but it should be at the end of the biological name. Okay, so these are the set of rules which have to be followed all over, and these are called as the universal rules of nomenclature. Okay, so we'll be looking into some of the questions, few questions which we have discussed today. Let's go ahead with the questions. As growth and reproduction appear to be same in case of what type of organisms? We all know that growth and reproduction appear to be same in case of organisms which reproduce asexually, unicellular organisms, yeast, hydra, planaria, filamentous algae, and amoeba, organisms which reproduce asexually. Of course, even though growth and reproduction types are asexual and sexual reproduction, but yeast is undergoing the process of budding, hydra will be undergoing the process of budding, planaria by regeneration, filamentous algae undergoes fragmentation, amoeba undergoes binary fission. But we know that growth and reproduction appears to be same in case of only the unicellular organisms. So henceforth, this option is right. Next one, reproduction can occur within members of what? So reproduction can occur within members of the lowest form, which we call it as species. So many species can undergo the process of reproduction. Reproduction is something where the species interbreed with the population. Okay, so henceforth the option will be species. We'll be discussing about class, family, genus later when we look into the taxonomy categories. Next one, what are the characters of living organisms? Growth, reproduction, cellular organization. Second one is ability to sense environment and mount a suitable response, ability to self-replicate, interact, emergence, movement, adaptation, variation, homeostasis, and lifespan, or all of the above. So because living organism has so many properties, apart from growth, reproduction, cellular organization, it can even self-replicate, it can interact. Emergence is a type of interaction. Movement, adaptation, variation, homeostasis is maintaining the internal condition. Lifespan is the time between growth and the death. So all these are the characteristic features of living organisms. Then comes photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is an example. We know that it is an anabolic process. It's a constructive process. Okay, so if the given question was respiration, then you can choose it as the catabolism, or you can say it as even destructive metabolism. Let's move ahead with the next question. Defining property of living organism. So which among the following is defining property of living organism? We know that the defining property should not have any exceptions. So henceforth, metabolism, growth, and consciousness are both A and C. Among the following, we know that growth is having exception, whereas metabolism and consciousness do not have any exceptions. So we can mark this as both A and C. Next question is based on binomial nomenclature. So binomial nomenclature includes two names given by two scientists, two names, one scientific, the other common, one name consisting of generic and specific parts, two names, one Latinized and the other one is non-Latinized. So we know that binomial nomenclature means it is one name consisting of generic and specific parts. Next question. Nomenclature is governed by certain universal rules. Which one of the following is contrary to the rules of the nomenclature? So among the four, we have to select which is the contrary, which is not going along with the nomenclature rules. The names are written in Latin and italicized. Yes, that's true. When written by hand, the names to be underlined. Yes, it has to be underlined separately. Biological names can be written in any language. It is not possible because it is derived, or it has to be originated from only Latin language, because Latin language is called as dead language. So henceforth the option should be this one, okay, which is not a contrary of the rules for binomial nomenclature. Next question. Specific epithet means what? We know that specific epithet is the second word in the scientific name of the species. So we can mark this as right. So ICBN and ICZN were the two abbreviations we learned. ICBN means International Code of Botanical Nomenclature. So it's not Indian Code of Botanical Nomenclature or Biological Nomenclature. It is International Code of Botanical Nomenclature. Right. Next question. Point out the correct method of showing scientific name of coconut palm derived by binomial nomenclature. So we have to see how exactly it is written. Cocos nucifera is written in different ways. Cocos nucifera is nothing but coconut. So we have to see which is the correct option, which is properly written. So the correct option here is option A, right? Cocos nucifera. Next question. The number of species that are known and described range between. We know that the range of species which have been known and described is 1.7 to 1.8 million. Coming to the last question, in biological name Mangifera indica, which was given by Linnaeus, what is indicated by Lin. So we know that it is the author citation or the scientist who have described this. So the option will be this species was first described by Linnaeus. Henceforth, it is named after that person. Okay. So we shall be looking into further topics in our next session. Thank you, students.